welcome, folks, to another episode of the Meta-Ideological Politics podcast. Today we're joined by Brent Cooper. Brent is an indispensable voice in the liminal scene, a meta-modern muckraker who uniquely takes seriously a few decisive things. One, that we actually want to get somewhere. Two, that this somewhere is both well-defined and well-rooted in long lineages of philosophical inquiry. And three, that the getting there will take a huge amount of old-school agency, planning, and critical distinction-making, rather than just pluralism and stylistic nuance worship as some sort of bubble-up emergent engine of change. Brent believes in solidarity of purpose. He's unabashedly a man of the left, and so is unabashedly a man of position-taking, even as he tries to uphold the meta-modern imperative of modal superposition. The difference is that Brent urges us to make moves. His abstract organization is an unapologetically political project with well-defined policy goals. Like salsa, Brent's moves are in 3/4 time, spotlighted in their constructed agential quality. This is all to say that Brent is perhaps one of the most purely, rigorously postmodern metamodernists, a radical oddball who refuses to slip easily back into regular, unsyncopated time. His scholarly works on the history of metamodernism, particularly his Missing Metamodern series, highlighting early theorists Moyo Okadiji, Albert Borgman, and Justo Gonzalez, are important and underrated. They were also my introduction to the liminal scene proper, so I have to thank you for writing them, Brent. And of course, we thank you for being here to chat with us.
Thank you. I appreciate such generous words, and of course, I could take myself down at the same time, and I think that's part of being metamodern and humble and self-effacing. But we'll save that for another time.
I wanted to jump in to what I think is an underrepresented or appreciated stream in your thought, which is, we could maybe call it the theological element. And I think a lot of people who read your work superficially might assume that you have a sort of ontology that is rather flat and atheistic, but it's not. Mm-hmm. You have a real appreciation for depth and for mystery, and you call yourself a mystic by nature. And I want to read a quote from the piece on Gonzalez, and it's you quoting Gonzalez, and Gonzalez is quoting David Tracy. And the quote is, "To the degree that postmodernity is the rediscovery of the radical, irreducible otherness of the other, it can be argued that postmodernity may lead the path away from religion as a general abstraction and back toward a theology that takes seriously the otherness of revelation and recovers the prophetic core of the Judeo-Christian tradition." And you also read about metanoia. You've just published a piece recently about metanoia, and you locate that concept in the Gospels. So I'm just wondering, what is your theological orientation? What do you think the role for theology per se is in your form of metamodernism?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great set of questions. And I do have that mystic spiritual side, and it's a big part of the abstract film. But that's also a satire, and I like to satirize and parody these things because there's limits to the metaphysics that we believe in. If you believe in angels or whatever, it's like at the end of the day, those are social constructs, and there's a finite material reality to our lives, right? And that can inform our spirituality instead of it just being an atheistic kind of driver. There's many touch points, with Gonzalez and also Borgman and others. Like, they talk about liberation theology. I think that's a core part of left discourse and praxis. Insofar as there's any authentic tradition of any given religion, such as Christianity, it's always contested, right? And if we're gonna, I said in a comment reply to somebody the other day on that piece, because they really liked the piece, and they were saying, they said at one point their relationship with Jesus, right? And they were, in a forward-thinking way, but in part of my reply, I said, the extent of my relationship with Jesus is as an imaginary friend. And we can historicize him and, speculate and debunk and talk about the myth of Jesus. At the end of the day, though, you can't physically meet him, but you can try to be a Christ. And so I think that's the destiny of all religions. And in that comment as well, I said, you know, if I didn't make it clear enough in my Metanoia article, that we live in a post-secular age, meaning we've gone through the secular Enlightenment, and kind of religion and theology and spirituality have come back, for better or worse, right? But that doesn't mean we can just lapse back in to calling ourselves Christians or Buddhists or whatever. So I said in that reply, you know, I appreciate world religions. I appreciate parody religions, whether it's like Flying Spaghetti Monster or a fictional religion like Jedi. And I appreciate civil religion, which is, you know, like Ryan on your podcast with Jeremy the other day, you mentioned Bowling Alone, right? That's a classic bestseller in sociology about community and to some extent civil religion. I think it's Putnam, right, who wrote that, but Robert Bella wrote about civil religion, right? And then, so that's like sports, nationalism, all the other things that fulfill a religious function, right? So we shouldn't limit ourselves to religions per se. And then, yeah, through my own kind of storytelling and, you know, life to some extent, I try to just follow the radical political spiritual path, right? Like if we're going to look up to Martin Luther King or Gandhi or whoever and you know, and to various extents problematize them too. Like Gandhi has a problematic legacy and reputation to different extents, but like I say in the Metanoia piece, like he can be a dialogue partner. So you know, and one I probably could just keep going down this thread, but one final point to kind of tie things together, like Alexander Bard's syntheism, right? Although he is a reactionary in my view, and I challenge him on that, his idea of syntheism, I think, is a pretty cogent philosophical discourse of meta-theology. You know, it's a kind of meta-modern approach. It's to say, look, we can actually sort of triangulate atheism, theism, entheism, pantheism, and this idea of a syntheos, kind of the internet, you know, because these are new things. The internet is new and novel. And Burning Man, of course, for better or worse, as a kind of syntheistic religious practice. Oh, Ryan, you've turned into a woman, into Rachel. Briefly there. Right. So, I mean, so this, you know, these things too, this is where I would challenge the typical discourses around spirituality, whether it's coming from pockets of the liminal web, or you know, different New Age and conspiritual groups, and even Vervaeke and his friend Jordan Peterson, the way they talk about it, right? It's like there's a lot of intellectual depth, but there's no pragmatic application. Like you know, I've pissed people off by calling Jordan Peterson a sociopath, and I can defend that. What I mean by that is that when it comes to leftists and you know, people of different spiritual stripes or people that disagree with them, he doesn't recognize their humanity. He doesn't listen to them. And that's sociopathic behavior, right? I'll leave it to the doctors to diagnose Peterson with psychopathy, right? If like Gabor Mate wants to psychoanalyze him, which he does. But when it comes to the socio, I think a lot of people are low-key sociopathic because they're just detached from an applied concern for the other, which you mentioned in that quote.
Yeah, that's what I loved about the quote specifically, and why I remember it 2 years or almost 3 years after reading it in your piece, the radical otherness of the other as a gateway into what was originally the core of the prophecy in Judeo-Christian religion, but then you know, also other religions too. I think Jordan Peterson's probably he takes the archetypes of Judeo-Christianity and reifies them too much. Whereas on the other side, in the liminal web, what we see a lot of the time is it's just taking the symbology-ism of different religions and sort of just playing with them. I hesitate to bring it up, but Jonathan Rowson the other day, Ryan, you told me this. He tweeted that he had put the ashes on his forehead for Ash Wednesday. He says, "I'm not quite Christian, but I appreciate the symbology of this, so I've done it to myself." And that struck me as interesting. I don't know if I find it problematic per se. I am Christian. I did it too.
Okay. Yeah.
But,
I mean, yeah, that's interesting. Like, I think, some people will want to be either playful or more habitual with their ritual participation. I think definitely we go through phases in our life where we commit to a particular discipline or holiday, if you will, as a social practice. I kind of come in and out of it, like I wasn't even aware of Ash Wednesday passing. So I'm rather detached in that sense, right? And there's always too many things going on, but again, I appreciate the world religions more. And I just wanted to make a point about Gonzalez and that piece before we move on. Like it's such a powerful catchphrase, whether it was the subtitle or it was the title of the chapter, I think, but metamodern aliens in postmodern Jerusalem, right? The whole thesis of his piece was speaking to kind of Hispanic people in America and the in-betweenness and the plight that they face vis-a-vis the Black struggle and indigenous struggle. And this various different status that they hold, and AOC is really a popular figurehead of this sort of thing too, especially as she's constantly under attack. Like it was just a week or two ago, Tucker Carlson was calling her a rich white lady. He was like aggressively erasing her identity in order to sort of silence and dismiss what she was saying, right? And to various extents, the United States has always had a kind of theocratic element, right? It's very pronounced with Bush, for example, and the different influence different evangelical movements have that are incredibly dangerous, right? Like there's no kind of spirit of Jesus making it through to the policy level to actually rectify the systemic inequalities and ongoing crises. It's just the opposite, kind of oppressive ignorance, forbidding education, right? And in that very sort of classical religious sense, if you will, like we're going to control what you think, and that's going to be best for the social order.
My favorite mystics in the Christian tradition, foremost of which is Meister Eckhart, and also Margaret Porete. I don't know if that's how it's pronounced, but spelled like that.
Don't know.
They emphasize that the idea is to move through this drunken sort of ecstasy of the union with God and to move toward the sober, higher sort of mysticism, which involves an egolessness and to scooch over and be the vessel. Which that's my favorite part of like the Mass, when we talk about moving over and being the vessel while still retaining some kind of agency, as I say. And that's the in-betweenness of metamodernism. How exactly are we going to retain this agency, like Rowson I think is trying to do, to say I'm constructing the meaning here myself. I don't need a church to help me do it, which I think is valid in some sense. But how to tell when the ego is coming in too much? What are your thoughts on that? Because it's a genuine question that I wrestle with.
Sorry, is your question to do with kind of like our need and positioning?
Recording stopped.
Our need and positioning with respect to organized religion, institutionalized religion versus individual.
Let's say institutions in general, maybe not religious, but political or otherwise, versus agency, creativity, play, confidence. I think confidence is part of it.
Yeah, I think one way I want to answer your question is like you said you're a Christian, right? And so I admire admire when I meet sort of, let's call them Christian mystics, right? People who are, and like Ryan, calls himself a normie insofar as he wants to remain as engaged as possible at the community level with all stripes of people. And that's a very authentic spiritual slash religious practice too. And so I admire what you're doing, because like for myself, let's say I'm doing the same as you and I go to a church and I identify as a Christian. There's a part of me that gets a little bit afraid and paranoid about all the people around me that might be taking it in a dogmatic way. And that's especially true with like mega churches, right? That's like, that's much more far removed from, right? So I would feel more comfortable in a black church, right? With that tradition, which again is the liberation theology, right? As opposed to white Christian evangelical tradition, right? So I admire people that try to stay in it as a social practice. But yeah, that doesn't change the fact that there's a slippery slope how we get roped into these institutions, because there is a power hierarchy, with all of these things, and so they don't want to be critiqued. The Catholic Church doesn't want to be critiqued. Like, sure, it can, like a state or a religion, they can occasionally get a more progressive leader, a more or less progressive person, and then that can kind of sway things. But by and large, right, look at what the Catholic Church did with the cover-ups of all the child abuse and stuff. There's too much self-preservation as the top priority in all institutions, right? All, like New York Times, WTO, IMF, UN, whatever it is. And I'm against that in principle, right? And that's why within the context of like an abstract organization, I want to be able to be fluid as an institution and autocritical, right? And that doesn't mean I'm just drifting from worldview to worldview. It means that you're trying to embrace the paradox, right? And this is why I say, like I said to this person in a comment, like, and I said in my article, like, I'm using all this, these Christian points of reference, but I think ultimately a sort of final metanoia, if you will, we can talk about it in sort of eschatological terms, like the end times and, Christian revelation, but also like, we gotta go beyond, come back to the secular, go beyond that into the post-secular, and recognize that, nominally, semantically, words like Christian, Muslim, Jew, etc., they will Buddhist, they will continue to be relevant, but as points of reference for learning and taking in a more global perspective, as opposed to, I'm going to just carry on this tradition. Like, you see the paradox, right? Even in the most noble form of carrying on that Christian or Muslim community, there's still a kind of boundary, between you and that person. And the only way to transcend it, and it's shouldn't be that difficult, but to just to find common ground in humanity, in like I said, civil religion, parity religion, which or synthetic, that interfaith. Syncretic also is a good term to apply to religion. It's not synthesis, but it's the kind of combination and integration of things. I just think that's better, and so at some point we have to distance ourselves from those labels, right? They can continue to be useful and invoked as per the situation. Like Martin Luther King's a good example too, because he used that language of religion and and God and whatnot, and that was binding. He didn't really do it in like partisan terms. Rather, it was like ecumenical. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, yeah. I wasn't even defining it, but that's the word I was looking for. Yeah, ecumenical, right? So, yeah, yeah. I mean, that's where these discussions have to go for me, right? And so that's why, like with the metanoia piece, like I was like very happy to kind of like, embody and sink myself into the Christian perspective and the Christian literature. And it's a novel heterodox part of the Christian literature, to be sure, right? But to revive that, because it has been a tradition that's been suppressed, right? And so, like, if we talk about the transcendentalists too in America, or the Quakers, I think those are they're called free thinkers, and those are good examples of early fusions of this kind of new spiritual wave, transcending religion. So that's where I'm at, and then we all have to come back to that mystical truth, that Gnostic truth, as it were, which is beyond language too, right? And there's different ways to get there, whether it's through meditation or psychedelics, and there's mild psychedelics like cannabis and strong psychedelics like mushrooms, and then there's a whole discourse about which again I touch upon in the article about psychedelics and philosophy and religion and Christianity and mushrooms to various extents. So yeah, insofar as we're trying to break everybody free of the matrix, but not cut out their scaffolding at the same time,
right?
We need to have this this solidarity and this understanding across labels, right? So like I love that you came to metamodernism and stuff through my work, and then like I have tons to learn from you in reverse, right? And to learn about myself through that engagement. So I don't, I'm trying to be an authority because I see so much bullshit being spun in the different discourses, but that's not to kind of construct a hierarchy over other people.
Yeah, the idea is to live in the paradox to some extent, or to appreciate the possibility of living in the paradox. And you've said elsewhere that the idea is neither orthodoxy, which of course we don't like. You and I both don't like orthodoxy, but on the other hand, it's not mere heterodoxy either. You can't just throw them all into a bowl and pick and choose. It's the paradox, which is, as you say, it's enigmatic. It's hard to talk about, and it's hard to know if you're doing it right when you're doing it. Maybe you feel in a resonant way if you're doing it right, but resonance is easily mistakable with the thrill of orthodoxy, the ecstasy of ideology. And so, of course, I just want to ask you, but you probably don't know either. How do you tell the difference? Or is it an article of faith, or what is it?
It's interesting. I mean, this will be kind of a crude answer, but I was dragged to church at various times when I was like 6 years old, right? And even then, it's like, oh, the Lord this and the Lord that, and I was like, I was not at all inspired by that kind of rhetoric. I was like, what are you talking about, right? Like this, the language the Bible is translated to is still kind of ancient by contemporary standards, right? And it doesn't have any real reference points, right? So the Lord this and the Lord that, and he saith and becometh, and like what? So I was bewildered that other people were getting roped into this, right? And it took me a while to understand.
Let me say, I was roped in. When I was a kid, I loved it. I was the most pious little kid. I went to Bible school. And then when I was a teenager, I moved in the opposite direction. One hard atheism and the new atheists, and the four horsemen. I was all about that. And then kind of in college, I started reading more nuanced people who brought me back. So I moved right through what you described and what Gonzalez described, of coming up against the alienation and figuring out, well, this isn't going to work. So what? And then it's not exactly to reach back, because I didn't reach back toward the pious before. It's moving through. So it's interesting that your temperament is not that at all. Your instinct is to recoil away, whereas my instinct is actually to move in.
it was to recoil, but at the same time, that didn't stop me as a teenager from, while also being skeptical, trying to study mysticism and trying to, watching Zeitgeist movies and thinking about Jesus that way. It's interesting you use the word pious too. Like a decade ago during the Occupy movement, I wrote a short little article. Not to say it was great or anything, but I was trying to do a little nuanced commentary on the thing. And I coined this word occupiety because Occupy was all about occupation, right? I looked around, and obviously I was on the Occupy side, the rebellion side, and I was in London. I looked at all these police, and they just looked like stormtroopers, like soulless, like fascist, like it was scary, right? And I recognized, the nuance there, that they're just, people doing jobs, and that sucks, and that there's a police state, and most of them have no idea how kind of just job seeking and following orders trickles down into those types of patterns and then gets them to do fascist things. Like kettling was like the official policy. Like, let's round up these protesters and make them scared and make them hostile and, and put them in prison. Right. And so I knew that the movement would fail regardless. That's not to say it was in the wrong. Like, I do think the Occupy movement stated clear goals to various extents, and then the media would be like, oh, who knows what they want, they're so disorganized, they're not being lucid. But the term occupiety, is an early meta-modern kind of portmanteau, kind of trying to theorize the fusion of that and in terms of spiritual practice, in terms of behavior, right? How we win by being more righteous and more pious than them who are assuming piety, who are assuming authority because they have guns and billy clubs. So yeah, and I was trying to touch on that kind of spirit that was there to an extent and needed to be named, I think, and more clearly defined. So it didn't devolve into riots and street violence.
Yeah. So the idea is to embody the paradox, embody the higher element of the paradox, and then maybe inject that into a system in which that behavior is anti-fragile. So slowly but surely it wins, which I think is probably the ethos of the abstract organization and your mission, as opposed to pure activism and just getting out there and speaking really loudly. There's also this element of living it.
Yeah, and I call it abstractivism just because, again, it kind of naturally, those words combine. And I said to Joe Lightfoot just the other day, like with respect to, social justice warriors and stuff and wokeness, the anti-wokeness, like I said, I'm not a frontline sort of worker on these things. And that's right. why I'm so passionate about defending frontline people, right? When social justice warriors, right, which that term used to have sort of positive, but problematic connotations. And then around 2014, it became a pejorative, distinctly. It became weaponized against student activists. Right. And so I take issue with that because those people need to be defended because they are frontline people, even if their practices are not perfect or if they're annoying people, they're in the right. I'm always like clear about that. And because their activism is based in literature that is right, like whether it's critical race theory or whatever it may be, like that literature is correct. And the way, the universities and academics, they're doing the best they can to spread these discourses, to teach critical thinking, right? Not just pass down this stuff dogmatically. And all these things, like all these subfields like critical race theory, I noted back in 2012, I drew up a list of a bunch of sort of new currents and turns that like if we might say neo-Hegelianism, whatever that might actually mean. But I came up with this list that were subfields that were gesturing towards a meta turn. and didn't know how to think of it more broadly and collectively, right? And so I think that still needs to be consolidated and synthesized and defined, to say, here it is. Yeah, welcome back, Ryan.
Oh, is he back?
Yeah, I'm really sorry.
Welcome back, Ryan.
Yeah, it's a little better. So continue on. I'll try to piece together what you're saying and jump in if I get a chance.
Ryan is having some internet issues. I'm having some computer issues, which is why I'm on my phone. And Brent is holding us all together here. So.
Yes, thank God for Brent.
Yeah, luckily the recording's going just fine on my end. So yeah, we're about half an hour in. Where should we take it next?
Well, Ryan, we just finished up talking about religion and a little bit about activism versus being the change and standing back away from the front lines, which Brent, that's what Brent does. Brent is the general ordering the troops and giving them structure and frameworks to attack.
It's not. I know you're half joking, but it's not exactly that either. I feel like I'm spiritually on the front lines. Like let me put it in stark contrast, right? Like that article I wrote about Arnav Gupta and self-immolation, right? 2019, he's a guy who lit himself on fire on the White House lawn. That is some holy transcendent warfare, right? And obviously he was struggling with various issues, right? But it happened. We just need to recognize that it happened, right? And it was barely noted in the media. Barely. And it was really strange. Like, even if there was like a press release from the New York Times, like nobody talked about it. And so I felt like that guy, though. I identified with what he was going through, with what he did, to various extents. And so I'm not trying to like lead per se or tell people what to do, but to build solidarity with that. And the flip side of that is like build consensus. We can't just have solidarity and be, kind of blindly all activating in various ways, because through the meta crisis, we know that all these causes converge. We need to solve all of them at once. So I'm trying to show that. I'll try to step into a frontline role where possible and where appropriate, but where not, because I'm just, on the internet from the middle of nowhere. I want to be on the front lines of the internet too, and kind of foregrounding what the real struggle is, and building coalitions and tipping points towards just doing the right thing, voting the right way, living the right way. And that doesn't come from a preachy authoritarian place, right? It comes from looking at what the consensuses are about these things, about permaculture, about degrowth, about conflict resolution, and peace building, and just leaning into that, right? And so, like you said at the outset, like, this is why I try to intervene on liminal web discourse. Try to call out its bullshit, try to break the sort of attitude of self-preservation, like I said, about all institutions. And at the same time, like, honor and enable people's greatest strengths that we all have, so we can actually like work together better as a collective intelligence.
Do you foresee this scene that we're in, the liminal web, so-called? I like to call it a scene because I think it operates basically just like the punk scene did in the 70s and 80s, or I equate it to music scenes. I don't think that its structure is actually very unique. It's all scenes are liminal.
Yeah, that's a good point.
A power there that we can tap into, or is it ultimately going to fizzle out, or is it ultimately that we pluck individual voices, individual actors, individual ideas from the scene? Or as I think Peter Limberg is all about, and Layman Pascal gave a talk on the Stoa recently about how to harness the liminal web in a convergent way toward something. I mean, do you foresee all of us together doing this thing, or what in the midterm, what do you see going on?
Yeah, I think about this question a lot because I always see these opportunities for new bifurcations, right? I lean cynical because I share with people what my hopes and expectations are for the benefit of everybody, and then they keep disappointing those. They keep falling short, right? And Layman's somebody I've talked to about this at pretty good length, right? So to some extent, I think he's trying to advance my ideas of convergence and stuff like this. And also the feedback I get is like, yeah, it's happening, but it's not happening as quickly as you want it to, right? I do think, I said this sort of thing from the beginning, going back to 2016, that we had a real opportunity to like build consensus, kind of weigh in more publicly on decisive moments historically, like the Bernie election, Jeremy Corbyn stuff, and the pattern of all these liminal spaces, with a few exceptions, right, has been to not really consume any left discourse as part of that so-called balanced diet, right? Like, so many people, like, the far right heterodox spaces, like Quillette and stuff like that, intellectual dark web stuff. There's people who are diehard into that, and many of them are just kind of crypto racist. But then there's a lot of people who are like, well, it's part of my balanced diet. I take in all perspectives. And so I'm not committed to this. Just on LinkedIn the other day, I got into it with a guy who shared a very recent Quillette article, and I looked at the article and I'm like, this is garbage. so hot garbage. And then he kind of like walked back and was like, I appreciate your critique. Like, I kind of want to see both sides of it, and I'm not overly committed. But the problem is, like, people don't seem to be aware, or they've willfully selected out leftist spaces for discourse, right? And I think there's rational reasons for that, right? Like, it might be too hyperbolic, or it might ring too true, but then that's too problematic to act on, sort of thing. But yeah, insofar as there's echo chambers, I think a lot of left spaces cover the right, but it doesn't, in good faith, but it doesn't go the other way so much. And so the whole political spectrum is tilted to the right. So a lot of moderate people are getting kind of seduced or roped into right-wing talking points because they have so much good faith or so much epistemic humility. They want to hear that position out, right? But what they don't realize in advance is that position is coded, and that the person saying it isn't necessarily well thought out or grounded. They're also just recapitulating some kind of right-wing talking point that's been coded. So I don't know if that answers the question. I kind of drifted off on a tangent on that one.
Let me try to jump in, just hoping that the internet holds up on my end. Kind of have my fingers crossed here. But yeah, Brent, I want to just kind of echo what you're saying and kind of share how I've been framing it in my own mind, right? And you listened to my talk I had with Jeremy on this podcast, and part of what I was saying, right, is the fear of engaging with certain perspectives, say left perspectives, whether CRT, Marxism, MMT, right, modern monetary theory, and a lot of these theories or ideologies, as they're kind of labeled pejoratively, are dismissed or not looked into with any sufficient level of nuance or complexity, or with the intention of extracting insights that can be integrated into a bigger picture. So part of meta-ideological politics is what should be our starting point or starting attitude towards exploring a wide range of different frameworks or analytic schools of thoughts and so forth, so that we can really truly have a balanced perspective and not skew in one direction without any awareness that we're skewing in that direction. You know what I'm saying? And so part of that, to me, overcoming that fear is from the standpoint of like political or civic education, right? It's like thinking non-exclusively about these frameworks. So it's not this fear of like, oh, if I read CRT or whatever, that's going to completely supplant everything I believe. But rather it's a certain set of insights and heuristics and perspectives that will enrich your understanding of complex reality in a specific way that we should probably consider. And that lowers people's initial resistance or barrier to entry, you know?
Yeah, these are good points. And I know you said something similar in your combo with Jeremy. I took a mental note of it. And so this shallowness of reading, like if somebody's against CRT as a knee-jerk reaction, this is my biggest pet peeve. My biggest, especially in liminal spaces, to take this sort of like reactionary approach, just to like buy into the right-wing talking points, you know, like James Lindsay, Christopher Rufo, like they publish something like, oh, it's from the Manhattan Institute or new discourses, like it's draped in all this like think tank aesthetics, which I'm also trying to emulate but also parody, but they're just lying through their teeth, right? And so it's a big pet peeve of mine because like with critical race theory, like any person who holds a kind of dogmatic view that it's wrong, that wokeness is wrong, reading a couple paragraphs in good faith will inoculate you, at least to the point of, oh, I'm gonna pull back on my hatred of CRT. Maybe I don't know as much as I think I did, you know? But for whatever reason, that's not what happens, right? The you know, Jim Rutt, David Fuller, they're just like, oh, CRT is racist, it's, you know, fucking disgusting. It's like, you know, how do we get to this point when people are making such egregious missteps on basic things? Not to say CRT is simple. It's not. It's a bunch of thick books and journals and various colored speakers and, you know, activist movements. And again, like we noted the other day, Ryan, like with MMT and CRT, like things that kind of try to go to the root of law, very abstract, very much over most people's heads, very high level abstraction to kind of take all of that in, right? But yeah, my general heuristic and advice to people would be like, just move left, you know, like go in the other direction, do a U-turn, start reading, because like I said, I really believe in good faith, that if people read in good faith, like they only have to get a couple paragraphs in before they realize that they've probably been pretty wrong to judge these things the way other bad faith actors have interpolated them. And, you know, a key feature of paradigm shifts, if we're to take Kuhn's definition, and you can problematize that too, but a key feature is anomalies, right? If your paradigm can't explain anomalies, or if it just takes what you think are anomalies and puts them into a tiny box and labels that race Marxism or something stupid, like, you know, that's regressing into previous paradigms, into lower resolution forms of thinking. And so the more, you know, anybody on their critical thinking path, whether you're doing it autodidactically, independently, or you're doing it through university, you need to try to find the best sources, let that complexity fill you up until it like is bursting at the seams, trying to break you apart. And you need to welcome that process, right? It's a kind of ego death. And it's a kind of like, in terms of trying to mentally hold and explain the anomalies, it will mount and mount until you have a better explanation for all of it. And then it'll become a new paradigm, right? A new paradigm can explain the anomaly. So like, again, back to MMT and classical economics, like, you know, if like the anomalies of classical economics are the extreme inequalities that are not supposed to normatively be part of classical economics, right? So the fact that they're there is the anomalies, the evidence, right? And so you need meta theories, you need CRT, you need MMT to draw a much wider hermeneutic circle and to try to explain everything. And so, when it comes to the role of the liminal web as intermediaries of this stuff, we need to do way better, or they need to do way better to kind of just consult the best sources, which in some cases is just a Wikipedia article, right? Just kind of getting an intersubjective overview, and then come back to the table, to the pulpit, and speak that truth, or give voice to that truth and that paradox, to come back to that. Like, there's the thing, paradoxical thinking is its own kind of subset of critical thinking. And there's lots of social paradoxes to recognize as such, that they're not easy to solve and they're not easy to understand. But normatively, it should be easy to determine the best values, eliminate hunger, poverty, ignorance, fear.
This reminds me of something I really want to get into with you, Brent, about thinking about hyperobjects and the epistemic frameworks that we need in order to see the hyperobjects, right? And this is where a lot of my interest in epistemic injustice, as articulated by Miranda Fricker, and the idea of hypocognition kind of come together, right? So hypocognition means you don't have the word or linguistic concept to capture a certain phenomena, so you don't see it, right? You can't see something because you don't have a word to label it. And this is on a societal level called epistemic injustice writ large, right? Which Miranda Fricker specifically calls hermeneutic injustice, which is where there's some kind of oppressive phenomena happening. Her example is like sexual harassment to women, much more prevalent historically. And we didn't, as a society, have a word or concept to label it. So we couldn't do anything about it as a culture. We couldn't address it. So in this case, sexual harassment to women writ large was a kind of hyperobject phenomena. But we didn't have the concept to capture it or see that was happening, so we couldn't do anything about it. And so one of my interests in meta-ideological politics is really the ultimate antidote to hypocognition, epistemic injustice, because we're arming ourselves, we're equipping ourselves with the frameworks, by having a diverse range of analytic frameworks, we're not going to miss things that we don't see, right? And this to me is the danger of bypassing certain ideological schools of thought, is that we then miss things that can only be illuminated through that lens, right? They're kind of like augmented reality glasses or goggles that can tune the mind's eye to see these hyper objects that are affecting people's lives negatively, so we can actually do something about it. So that's kind of my pitch. And I've also found that framing to be helpful for people as a kind of way for them to start exploring a framework and experiment in your perception of complex systems and to illuminate these hyperobjects. And then we can start to converge and deliberate on the best ways to address them, right? But in order to address them, what I'm saying is, even more fundamentally or even more primordially than sense making, there's this aspect of seeing. And if we can't have those initial abstractions to see, then we're not going to get anywhere. So that's kind of like part of what I like to emphasize is seeing. And how do we see things? We learn, we read, we study, we steel man, we diversify our analytic toolkit.
Yeah, and not to get new agey, but like the third eye, if you will, like that's a mental projection, right? So we have two eyes for visually seeing, and we take in sense data through our senses, but then it's all in your head after that, and it's all a jumble, and we all think through many levels of abstraction to educate ourselves and to juxtapose different ideas. But I'm going to skip the hyperobject part of the question. Maybe we can come back to that. But the epistemic justice thing, right? There's a lot to say there. My understanding is that there's two main forms. I think we could define a whole bunch of forms, but Fricker kind of boils it down to hermeneutical injustice and testimonial injustice. Right. And across the liminal web, throughout my history with these things, And you know, given the fact that it was a cornerstone of my research from the beginning, and now Consilience Project is like, oh, we're all about this. It's ironic, but also, yeah, what I'm saying is this is a good frame because there's been provable, repeated instances of epistemic justice, right? So, you know, and one that comes to mind is like, you know, Jordan Peterson last fall. There was the racist kind of incidents with a football player and a particular football club, right? There was a Pakistani guy and his teammates even, and other members of the club would like call him derogatory names, and I asked them to stop, and then there was a kind of systemic suppression of it, right? And so it became an issue of systemic racism, not just one-off instances. And so that happened, and then Jordan Peterson's on a panel to discuss this on some British news show, and he just goes into a rant, an aggressive rant, saying, oh, any talk about systemic racism is low-resolution thinking. I should be doing the voice for you, Ryan, shouldn't I? Anybody who talks about systemic racism is wrong. It's low-resolution thinking, right? And I said, I think I told this to some people yesterday, like, you know, all the books on this subject, there's nothing low-resolution about it. Right, it's incredibly high resolution, and so, you know, Peterson's committing an epistemic injustice there, and then you know, the media, other media tries to call him out. His fellow panelists try to call him out, and he just doubles down and gets angry and, oh, that's not what I said. But like, you know, and then I try to talk about it in like different Facebook groups, and then there's an epistemic injustice there, and then, you know, so it's a cascade. It's a pattern of epistemic justice. And then when it comes to like my Peterson critiques, my Game B critiques, that was all ignored or suppressed by various people, in both senses of hermeneutic and testimonial. Right. If we're refusing to hear people out, that is actively committing that kind of epistemic crime. And you know, again, to go back to the simple point, it's like if people are actually good faith and they just look up the definitions before they go and you know, comment on something like critical race theory, we wouldn't be stuck in these traps, right? And in the false epistemic humility that keeps us stuck in those traps. So the whole culture war thing, like it's very real. It's just another front of economic war too. And because of the knowledge inequality and the kind of epistemic hegemony of pundits, centrist liberal pundits that want to keep their cushy jobs, you know, we get really stuck and confused, and it feeds the debate, right, rather than better nuanced and paradoxical approaches kind of as exit strategies.
And just someone to add there, Brent, I would say that part of the issue and how I see it is that when people are critical or they're lacking what I call Dunning-Kruger awareness, right? We don't know how much we don't even know about something. The critique, let's say like a typical reactionary style of critique of some kind of left idea, is itself also coming from an ideology or framework. It is a kind of a school of thought, whether it's a tenet of conservatism or something, that people are enacting without the awareness that it is. And so the problem with that is people just think, oh, like my criticism of something is just common sense, or it's obvious to everyone, or, you know, I'm not ideologically blinded or brainwashed, and therefore I can see clearly, when that critique is very ideologically loaded too. Right. So my interest in increasing political and ideological literacy across the board I think is important for people's own frameworks, their own implicit frameworks, to become illuminated to themselves, to say, hey, oh, whoa, I didn't know that I was falling into a certain line of thinking without any awareness that I was, while blaming everyone else that they were ideologically brainwashed, while I'm seeing a reality objectively.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's. Go ahead.
It's almost as if you have to do that twice, though, because there's the first thing that you're in, and I think the reason that a lot of the liminal web is more sympathetic to the right than to the left is because a lot of them went to liberal arts schools where they were forced to read a lot of liberal arts works. They were forced to read Foucault and Judith Butler and all these people that they didn't really like because they were made to read them in college. And then they get out and they read something right wing and they think, oh, there's something here. This is it. Now I see. And they forget and they never go back and reread those texts. And so, and just like the punk movement, where it was like, we're free from the establishment. We see everything now, but what did they really end up doing? Not a whole lot of anything, because they were still trapped in the reaction. That's what a reaction is. And so, you have to do it like a third time, to triangulate and then shoot back towards the self almost.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I think that's absolutely true. At the same time, we don't want to like fetishize it as like a Hegelian dialectic or spiral, but like it's true. It's true that, that's why syllogisms are a thing and triangles are a very strong shape, but we need to keep applying it again and again and again and again and again, right? Recursively and reflexively, right? And so for me, that's the meta perspective, right? I use words like that to apply to these things. And
it's the metanoia.
Yeah.
You quote an author in your recent piece who says, I have 500 instances of metanoia.
Right. I juxtapose, there was a TED talk that's like, you have 140,000 in a lifetime versus like some authors were saying like, it's very rare, like once every 10 years, right? I think both are true, depending on how you frame it. But if you're having a bunch of small metanoias and you're still ending up in the place of being an old white boomer who's reactionary, you're not doing it right. and so, to the point about punk and stuff like that, like and the aesthetics of revolutionary movements, I think it's, it's great to like go through that, as a student and embrace it, find your way to be a part of it, but not to let it overwhelm you and think that that's the end. Because like, and one way I frame this is like, well, anti-capitalist is a bit too far to the left. I think they have a point, obviously, right? Like there's no reason to like censor them or dismiss them, but to try to integrate them. But post-capitalist is just a different discourse and a different word. And I think it's more salient. Like it's less game denial and more about game change, in that, look, we're not going to just abolish capitalism overnight or even over 20 years. It's here to stay, but we have to integrate it. And you can imagine, layers or a pie where you have some elements of social life determined through capitalism and markets, and some through socialism, and some through communism to some extent, right? Like water, air, speech, you want to be in some effect communized, communalized and made free and abundant. And so by the same token, like there's many communists I like, but I myself wouldn't be able to identify with it. It's sort of a conversation stopper, right? Whereas socialism, like Albert Einstein was a socialist, George Orwell was a socialist. There's a tradition here. There's a legacy here. And that is alive in parts of today's left. And so we have to always try to thread that needle, and stick to that, that coalition building and that broad consensus. Like I spoke with a Marxist organizer a couple years ago. It's actually like, there's like a Marxist Party of Canada kind of thing. And I was like, I appreciate what you're doing. I want to work together, but like, you're not going to recruit me for your movement. I don't think it's ever going to win. I think a lot of the language is outdated and puts people off, whether it's talking about the mode of production or whatever it is. And I said, what I want to do with you is kind of teach you a bit about this metamodernism discourse and communities, because we need more leftists, right? We need more kind of balance. and he wasn't all that interested. You know, he had kind of a limit to his ability to consume new ideas in that sense, right? And so, and that's an example of how the left can be at odds with itself, because you have these hardline people, which I want to support in principle, but a Marxist party is never going to run Canada, and I wouldn't want them to. You know, there's just too much kind of orthodoxy, if you will, with their approach. Like the website's all red. It's all about class war. And you know, the more meta perspective and integrative approach, whatever we want to call it, it's much bigger picture kind of still trying to push through an international socialist, cosmopolitan socialist, leftist discourse and political platform. But so insofar as you have more niche parties to the left of that, I don't see how that's helping.
Yeah, Brent, let's talk about this. So this is really fun because I'm not going to say this is like the meta-ideological approach to this question of meta-theory education, or how we work with diverse coalition and camps who all have their own vision of social change and their own ideology and philosophy, right? This is more like a Ryan Nakade approach, but taking this Marxist dude in Canada as an example, like obviously I agree with everything you said in terms of the viability and the aesthetics and practicality of that, their, you know, theory of social change. But I have not had success, and I gave up this venture several years ago, trying to actually pitch meta-theoretic approaches to supplement or buttress their ideology, because all of them are very committed. They're, you know, a little rigid or locked into their worldview and their camp. And so just in terms of like, hey, like maybe consider this or this, it was just like rejection after rejection. So what I changed to was saying, okay, if this is what you believe, I'm going to study your ideology and your philosophy. I'm going to talk to you on your own terms, right? I'm going to try to find what insights or what, you know, nuggets I can glean, or you know, what is a value of what you're saying. And how can I talk to you on your own terms? And if they're interested, right, kind of like do like, you know, working with them in terms of how they present and their advocacy and stuff, so that they can still do something of net positive to the community, even if they don't know that they're doing that, right? So it's like, how can we work together where your actions will produce positive externalities, even if unintentionally, so that you don't have to change your ideology or belief system, right? But rather changing how you present it or how you advocate for it will still be of net benefit in somehow moving the needle towards mass metanoia, but in their own very idiosyncratic niche way. And so part of my work now, my professional work, right, in community development, living in Portland, obviously every organization I work with is definitely a leftist organization, activists, racial justice advocacy, et cetera. They all have their own little lane, and they're not going to change or expand their mind. So I said, fine, you don't have to. I'm not trying to tell you to become more meta-ideological or arm you with meta-theories. Let's just talk about what you want to do on your own terms, and hopefully in doing so, you can maximize synergies with other stakeholders and parties, minimize redundancies, generate positive externalities for everyone, and communicate your message more effectively, so we can all cross-pollinate each other and kind of mutually expand our worldview. So I'm wondering what you think of that approach in contrast to the challenges of real meta-theory education, which people are not open to.
Yeah, that's great stuff. And I don't have any critiques of it on the surface. I think you provide a very useful role. Part of my answer is going to be in the form of, you know, that's what I want to create with the abstract organization is not what you're doing, but the kind of umbrella organization, so to speak, right? And so because I see all these different causes, right, and you know, I care about animal rights, but that's a good example to show what you're saying about different organizations that have a very, very narrow and precise goal, right? Like PETA, for better or worse. You know, I know they're always embroiled in controversy, but you know, that's their goal, is just animal rights. And on some level, all of these groups know, like, everything's entangled, you know, climate change, racial justice, you know, abolishing the military industrial complex, etc. So yeah, there's got to be not necessarily a middle ground, but you do what you're doing and I do what I'm doing, and hopefully both of our approaches work. But at the end of the day, like different institutions and organizations, they can stick to their mandate, whatever, but I don't see them achieving their goals any faster if we're not all also striving for paradigm shift. And what I mean by that is like institutions and even nonprofits with political advocacy and programs. Some will endorse a candidate, right? When it comes to the Bernie Sanders movement, like it would have been great to see a convergence there. Some will not, right? Like, let me just use effective altruism as a kind of punching bag for a moment to say, like, they've got their specific goals. I don't agree with their methods. There's a ton of critiques out there. And they might make excuses for like not participating in politics. Like, oh, that's not our mandate. We just want to do this thing. And that's all about optics. That's got nothing to do with actual functionality. I think, I think those organizations would do better in the world to build a quick internal consensus and say, you know what? As an institution, we should endorse this person. We should take the risk, put our necks out there. And it's interesting if we talk about Black Lives Matter for a second. I've always been pro BLM despite its problems, but one thing I learned, might have to fact check this, but that I think they endorsed like the New York Times endorsed Amy Klobuchar. And it wasn't Elizabeth Warren, was it? It was another woman. Anyways, the New York Times endorsed two women, right? And I think BLM endorsed other candidates besides Bernie. And it's like, what are you doing? What the fuck are you doing? Like, I can't get on board with that. Like that. This is why you have a public relations image issue. This is, there's different reasons people attack BLM, right? But, it got its kind of Pyrrhic victory with the Biden administration and painting Black Lives Matter all over the streets and in big letters. Very performative, right? That war won't be over until like millions of Black people in prison are released and rehabilitated, right? Like most of them are in there are on like misdemeanors, really bunk drug charges and stuff, right? And so it's always about the substantive goals. And BLM is not ignorant of those things. They're for systemic racial justice and overhaul. But because the left had no meta theory and no meta movement, I think that ushered in its disintegration and the factionalization. So, to return to your point and your question, right? I think there's absolutely a role, an imperative, necessary role for your approach, and vice versa. Like, to try to create an umbrella org and try to have it be kind of a permeable membrane, if you will, that different organizations can opt in and out to the fluid consensus as we build it. But yeah, and this is what I mean by paradigm shift, right? Like all the things Jordan Peterson is wrong about, or anti-woke people are wrong about, all, and where's the conclusion and the synthesis of these kind of broken left movements from the 60s, right? The new left being fragmented and co-opted in different directions. It just keeps reemerging in different aesthetic movements like Occupy, Zeitgeist, Black Lives Matter, Bernie, right? Which came very close to winning the primary both times. And so, and even then, when you win, that's not the end of it, right? So I think we just need to be consistent and own our mistakes, hold each other accountable. And to kind of answer a point I think Nate made earlier, both of you made, about kind of the future of these groups and whether we should be cynical or optimistic. I think, you know, it's a very clear path, at least directionally, to just to converge, to confront each other, to move left politically on that informed political spectrum. At the same time, we're trying to revise what political mapping means normatively and descriptively. And yeah, like you're saying, Ryan, though, like it's always been a tough sell to kind of get different leftist groups into meta theory. And I'm just hoping that by us creating this type of content with a consciousness towards that it can start to snowball soon. And that, you know, if we get key leftists on board, that they can then, you know, deploy their knowledge and experience and position to give voice to these things that we've struggled to give voice to. Because again, like all these independent movements, animal rights, environmental rights, women's rights, minority rights, etc., it's all part of the same kind of struggle against systemic oppression, regardless of, you know, who the agent of that oppression is. It's about building consensus towards that emancipation from exploitation, and the Russia invasion of Ukraine is yet another clear example to talk about these things, kind of the asymmetry in terms of approaches and violence. And because it's a Western country and it's so stark and dramatic in this narrative of Russia versus them as a proxy and against the world, that the world is finding alignment, right? Like Joe Biden, who leftists don't like, he's trying to be determined in opposition to Putin. And all these different institutions are sanctioning Russia. They're denouncing Putin specifically. Like I mentioned over text there, like the Strelka Institute, right? Design think tank based in Moscow. Like they're like, we're not having any part of this bullshit. And like we're, you know, boycotting all of it. We're gonna pull out our operation, which I think to a large extent was based in Russia in good faith in the first place, right? Trying to do good in the world, thinking about a paradigm shift. And they're like, you know, like, no, fuck this. Everybody has to, you know, this is a good opportunity for enemies, so to speak, to converge on a very simple moral imperative, which is to oppose Putin. And that not just to the point of getting him to stop, but all the way to putting him in prison. And that might seem like a very fanciful, unrealistic notion, but, you know, I don't care. It's the right thing to do. It's the right attractor to hold, because it's just so transparent, you know, regardless of like other factors like the United States and NATO. Because like if I'm to extend this leftist argument to you know, to stretch it sort of ad nauseum, like, you know, a lot of leftists think the Bush administration are war criminals and should also be in prison, right? So myself included. So these types of things are barely even possible to say within the current paradigm. It's like, oh, you're crazy. It's never going to happen, right? But like Bolsonaro put Lula in prison unjustly. Why can't we put Bolsonaro in prison? Because it's the right thing to do. Why can't we put Trump in prison, who's, you know, on an ongoing basis under investigation from the Department of Justice and the New York Attorney General, I think. So it's like, let's do it. Let's converge on these real ambitious ideals, galvanize world sentiment and mobilize political will, make it happen and anticipate the reaction. get ahead of it, because we're out of time, right, when it comes to climate change and further political unraveling.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, go ahead, Nate.
It's just a minor. Well, it's not minor. Hopefully, as a result of all this, it expands to matters that are not purely in our geopolitical orbit. For example, the civil war in Ethiopia that's been going on for months and months, or the coup in Myanmar last year, which the Biden administration had next to nothing to say about. Though it was obviously unconstitutional, human rights violation. So,
right.
I'm doubtful. I'm cynical about this coming together thing that's happening now as a broad human rights focused ethos. I think it's more to do with Putin is an easy guy to hate, and we need an enemy.
I fully agree.
Obviously maniacal and horrible. I don't know about our motivations in the West.
I fully agree. There's a lot to say on this point. Like some of the commentary I've been collecting has been about the coverage, the biased, kind of racist even coverage to like explicitly say like, oh, Ukraine, it's not some third world nation. It's they're white Westerners like us, right?
Explicitly saying this.
Yeah.
I find that disgusting.
It is disgusting.
Like us.
It is disgusting.
And they don't mean Western. They mean white.
Yeah. And so I'm trying to honor the cynical point you're making and say that that's true, but I'm also trying to hold the meta perspective on this situation that says we need to hold that, right, Ryan? Because nobody else is holding it. We need to hold that meta perspective to say that even if I'm being a little bit too hopeful, this is still an opportunity for us to make those points that we're making. Like, yes, it's a simple kind of position to take, to denounce Putin and take Ukraine's side. But then what, right? And what about all these other conflicts? What about Yemen? What about Israel-Palestine, right? And so this is the meta perspective I'm always trying to hold and always trying to interject into different scenes, which then invariably just pisses people off in rather than them going, oh, yes. Oh.
Yeah. I want to comment a little bit on the holding of the meta perspective, because, I've a couple things here, right? Like I've criticized, my critique of almost every camp, but specifically this conversation, right? We're talking about intra-tribal polarization on the left, right? Everyone's kind of locked into their own little activist silo, and the analysis becomes very reductive because everyone only has like one little slice of the pie. And the externalities from that very reductive frame are very polarizing, very divisive, even if different groups are working towards the same goal, presumably. And so I think part of what we're trying to promote in meta-ideological politics, other than being like anti-polarization, right, is also anti-reductionism. And I think that's what you're also trying to plug with your work on meta theory, is that you can hold a larger container space of ideas and perspectives so that it's not this reductive battle of like race reductionism and class reductionism and, reducing it all to one identity category, or, really, animal rights or the environment. And it's like, well, there is a larger picture here. There's a larger goal that diverse groups are working towards, but because everyone's in their own little reductive lane, the analysis isn't holistic enough. The solutions become ineffective or counter synergize, right? Or there's just all this infighting and there's no consensus or convergence, right? So expanding the frame to me is really important. Have a holistic analysis. One joke I make is, a lot of people will blame the left for being too intersectional, right? All this intersectionality is creating all this division. My joke is that the left is not intersectional enough. Right? It's like, that's my jujitsu move. It's like, we're not taking enough variables into consideration.
Yeah.
And so the solution is not as wide ranging as it could be.
That's right. Yeah. Because with intersectionality, it's defined as just three axes, right? And we can add to that. We can say, well, knowledge, epistemics is another axis of that inequality. And that too is comorbid with these different groups. And again, the theory is not absolute, right? Like just because somebody is, a black woman, it doesn't imply that they're less informed automatically, right? They might be more informed. And that's why it's like, it's a counterintuitive model, right? It's paradoxical. But yeah, we need more axes of intersection. There, health is another one that you could add to it. And so, we're going beyond a sort of Cartesian three-dimensional matrix just by adding axes, right? And you get different types of geometries. And then it's like, then it gets more confusing. And then it's like, oh, now we're talking about sacred geometry. And like, so it folds back into New Age funnels. When hyponoia came up, it made me think of Anthony Judge. He's somebody I cited in my metanoia piece. And I kind of focus on the contrast between metanoia and paranoia, just like metamodernism and hypermodernism. And of course, these are kind of simplifications without sort of making the reduction fallacy. But Anthony Judge has written for decades with the highest order of complexity approaching these things, right? And so I think I know in my paper he's got a few models where he keeps adding things to it, and he does a lot of geometry. And so hyponoia is another pole beyond metanoia and paranoia, right? And that speaks to the hidden. And so just by knowing these words, it's another way to think more in more complexity terms.
I like the metaphor of and Hanzi uses it. I don't know if he uses it in this way, of the listening society, which, as we said before, to open the third eye, you close your two eyes and you listen. You listen. So the other axis is not some hidden new agey axis of seeing. It's the axis of listening. Close your eyes. Be reactive. Close your eyes and listen, and that's where you hear depth. You don't exactly see depth because everything is in one plane in front of you. You can through parallax and other means in the brain, you can infer depth, but you don't actually see it. But you do hear depth. You can hear whether something is resonating right here or is far away and not worthy of being listened to. I like to expand on that metaphor of the listening society in that way. Anyway.
Yeah, no, it's resonant for me too. It relates directly to testimonial injustice, right? If we don't, like, as a practice, listen to each other, we're going to miss that. The idea of a meditation practice and institutionalizing it the way Hanzi does, to say, like, look, here's the research, proves that it works. We can, you can't force people to do it, but studies show that, like, you introduce it into prisons, you get better outcomes. You introduce it into schools, you get better outcomes. And that is about, in large part, listening to yourself and to your mind's chatter. Helping it quiet down, but also just listening acutely, and then listening to the other, as we've touched on, seeking out the research and the voices and the testimony of different people all over the world, right? Like, especially, Palestinian journalists and academics who are routinely, systematically subjected to cancellation, let's say. So, it's built into Hanzi's work. I've always felt a strong affinity with that work, even though I have my own critiques. But my impression has been that the community that is formed around Hanzi is, and more so these other communities, is that they don't get it, and that makes me conscious of my own work too, and how that's read or misread and misunderstood. I think it's easy to see examples of people misrepresenting works. And by the same token, like, there can be authors with problematic histories or biographies, like Heidegger being a Nazi, right? It's like, people will be like, oh, I can separate out that and, like, just look at his work on its own terms. And it's like, really? Can you? I don't think you can, right? And that's not to dismiss it completely. Like, I think, Ryan, you said in your conversation with Jeremy, it made a mental note. You're like, got to read Dugan, got to read this and that. And I'm like, okay, sure. Like, and I'll read some of it. I find it quite painful. Like, for example, like with James Lindsay and guys like that, like Matt McManus who will review their books, right? Like sincerely, like he's a masochist to do that, right? Like
Put me in the same camp.
Yeah, and I'm a masochist too, but I don't have the time or the patience to cover all of it. And with Dugin, it's like you know, David Griscom made a great point about this kind of thing too. He's like, you have to read The Economist. You have to read the Washington Post. Yes, these are like centrist, conservative, liberal institutions. But the interesting thing is that, you know, more than half the time, it's these elites being sincere and telling on themselves, right? So it's very informative to read them and to speak their language. And then that's how you confront it. What I'm against, though, however, is the uncritical reading of these things and the kind of like sensationalizing and like, oh, the fourth political theory. Like, my takeaway is that it's not good theory. And then, you know, you have the Stoa has Dugin on, and Technosocial even had Dugin on, and, you know, they're not really there to push back, like, or to challenge. They're not even prepared to do so. And so it becomes a self-defeating exercise. Like, that's where listening goes wrong. Like, oh, I'm going to invite this person and I'm just going to listen to them. It's like, well, did you listen to the part where Dugin's been advocating for invading Ukraine for years on end? Because there's a direct correlation here.
Absolutely.
You know?
Absolutely. So one thing I want to say about it's funny you bring that up, because we're talking to Layman Pascal tomorrow about critiquing and reappropriating controversial thinkers or philosophers that have been appropriated or ideologically kind of subsumed in very problematic ways that lead to something like neo-fascism or whatever. But I do think that there is space for kind of creative reinterpretations or harvesting insights. In the example I always give is like Nietzsche and Heidegger are two thinkers that they're part of the alt-right canon. Nazis in the 30s, kind of appropriated their insights and kind of took things that they said. And so did postmodernists, right?
Yeah, just on that point though, like, with Nietzsche, like, my understanding is that most of that is just based on The Will to Power. And The Will to Power was published posthumously by his crazy sister. And so it was edited to reflect more of a fascist tone, right? And whereas Heidegger was a card-carrying Nazi, right?
Yes.
To the bitter end, sort of. So I never really read Nietzsche as a real far right figurehead, but definitely through The Will to Power, that was very influential and taken up by Nazis, right? So I just like to make that caveat about Nietzsche, but I could be a little bit missing the mark too, but yeah, he's inspired a lot of leftism as well,
right? But so it's funny though, because I've heard that too. I just finished a book by an author who's extremely critical of Nietzsche and Heidegger, and he just made the argument that in all of Nietzsche's writings, you can find some neo-Nazi material. Okay. I don't know if I can't really comment on that because I haven't read Nietzsche extensively myself, but people are saying that he's more problematic than just what came out in Will to Power.
Sure. I think I don't know if a satirist is the right way to describe him. Like, he's not Mark Twain, but there's definitely a lot of like, I don't know if you call it trolling either, but like taking the piss, right? Like, Nietzsche was a subversive thinker for his time. So, yeah.
No, I think Nietzsche was a poet, and a lot of times in a lot of his works, he's explicitly setting up characters that are talking to each other to represent different points of view in the same way that Plato did. No one knows what Plato thought, really, because he was putting all these characters against each other. So I think Nietzsche's goal a lot of the time is just to paint a thought as opposed to advocating for it. Whereas Heidegger, as you say, was a Nazi. And it's actually quite clear looking at his philosophy how a pathologized version of the philosophy is fascism or Duginism. And Heidegger's biggest influence to Dugin. And it's just taking his the ready at hand mode and taking it stupidly, anti-intellectually, and turning it into fascism.
Yeah. So. And that's not to say there's not a leftist read of Heidegger too, but Heidegger Rene Girard, right? Like you said, Julius Evola the other day, Ryan, like those names keep coming up again and again and again on the right, right? And like, whether it's like intellectual deep web waxing about Rene Girard or Peter Thiel, who like did his dissertation on Rene Girard, like clearly there's a right wing kind of affiliation and consistency here, which I'm against. I say is not good. If you're so enthralled and absorbed with these thinkers, but you don't see how it's part of your legitimation of your conservative worldview, we're just stuck in the same old trap.
Right. Another example that comes to my mind in terms of thinkers being reappropriated to different sides is Antonio Gramsci.
Mm-hmm.
Cultural hegemony. And, he was, a Marxist analysis, obviously left at his time. And now I read an article recently that the right has really appropriated this idea of cultural hegemony and is using it to critique what they see as like woke cultural hegemony.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just, to me, this is an interesting exercise, though, in like how do we develop a kind of critical literacy or meta-ideological literacy where we have an awareness of how different ideological camps are appropriating material and slanting them, right? Or how we're kind of biased and reading in, we're doing very what's the word, like confirmation biased reading of stuff, texts, right?
Yeah, I don't have an answer in terms of past authors like Gramsci. I think, I guess a deep reading would speak for itself, right? Like if what they self-identify as. But I think about this question a lot as a writer, and it kind of touched on it with what I was saying about Hanzi and my own work. I don't want to see it appropriated by right-wing thought or movements, and so I try to be clear. And it's difficult when you write different articles, each has its own kind of theme and limited scope. There's not space to kind of declare your affiliations at the top of each article so that people aren't confused. So it's kind of a paradoxical thing when it comes to writing too. And so I want to write as little as possible, and I want to be as succinct as possible. And there's different levels of density you do that at. But I also, it's with language, it's quite easy to be misunderstood, right? So if you say you're left, that's going to mean different things to different leftists. It's going to be allergic on the surface to right wingers. So, it's a paradox, and this is why, like you guys say at the beginning, I'm kind of unabashed, unapologetic. But I try to find the best anchoring points, like, the Bernie platform, that wasn't possible to say before 2015. And then it became possible to like point to a tangible movement that was actually the continuation and the synthesis of many past movements. And so we need to continue to do that, obviously, to crystallize that policy program, Green New Deal sort of stuff. And to depolarize language. And, I said to Gavin Palmer yesterday, because, he says he is looking for kind of, techniques and hacks and ways to scale. He's an engineer. So he said he wants to scale kind of critical thinking and post-ideological thinking. And so my answer to him was to warn against the kind of game B approach, which is like very individualist, all about sovereignty building, and say like, here's a toolbox of things you can use. It's like, no, fuck that. I said, Gavin, you wanna scale critical thinking? Support education infrastructure. That's it. Vote for that. Vote for debt forgiveness, student debt. Vote for education expansion, because like universities are under attack from the right, right? And so, there's no way to scale kind of mind hacks and psychotechnologies that liminal web folks are developing on the fly in a kind of pluralist way that doesn't really prove itself or pan out in the short term. It's always been that we should anticipate the erosion of education infrastructure through neoliberalism and do the opposite. Advocate for it. Advocate for the expansion of university culture to give everybody a place and access to education, right? That's the highest point of intervention and leverage.
Yeah, totally. And it reminds me too that I work with different organizations that are affiliated with universities, and one's called Civic Synergy, and they do depolarization work, and I facilitate college students of diverse backgrounds to come together and formulate transpartisan policy proposals that they propose to Congress. And it's so exciting to be in an environment where like all these college students from all over the US are so excited about getting beyond polarization, about civic engagement, about all these things. And what they complain of is like there isn't enough of that at the college that they're going to. And so for them to kind of all converge together through this online, it's through MIT and Boston College. They're like really excited, and and I just started thinking like, man, like I agree with everything you said, and I think that also I think colleges, this gets back to the meta theory education stuff, right? Like I would, if there was a kind of a mass metanoia that took place at universities where they could start teaching all the stuff we're talking about, that would be the biggest transformative leverage point. I've never, as I was saying, I'm a high school dropout. I'm from college, so I can't speak to campus dynamics or what's going on.
I could speak
there.
a little bit to that point. I mean, things are obviously changing year over year and decade over decade. When I was in university a decade ago, they were just starting to institute more common core type of stuff. They had something called Arts 1 and Science 1, and that was like you could get a more generalized degree, right? And my field, international relations, is already a hybrid kind of program. And so there's this direction that the universities know that to deal with today's complexity, they need more generalized students. So there are those directions happening. But at the same time, like all universities need massive reform. And, part of what we're doing with metamodernism in academia or para-academia is trying to formalize that turn, right? And so you have the Vermeulen and Van den Acker and Gibbons book, which is sort of academic driven. You have Hanzi and other authors, which are kind of para-academic. And then you have Jason Storm, who his theory is not perfect either, but it's got some great starting points, some great like leftist sort of confessions, and it's published by the University of Chicago, right? So the more legitimacy these things have, the more they'll be able to get read in universities and integrated. Yeah, you can't just expand education infrastructure as it is because it's very neoliberal. There's a lot of like, sure, the content is like left wing, but the administrative structure is right wing, kind of capitalist, right? And I remember this kind of thing going back to high school. One day our high school did not have pop machines. The next day they did. And I'm like used to seeing commercials on television, right? But to see a Coke machine, and even in high school, I knew Coke was an evil corporation, right? Just, you get a kind of cultural literacy from like watching The Simpsons or whatever. But it's like, that was kind of a shock to me to have this branding introduced into a public education space, right? In a subtle, accepted way. Like, oh, it's just soft drinks and like people are thirsty. No big deal, right? But I was more cynical about it. And that's it's an anecdote, but that's the pattern that you see wash over the university structure and make tuition more expensive for students and make the prospects for jobs narrower and narrower, right? So we need a paradigm shift in every sector, right? Military, business, religion, academia, media, right? However many others you can list, law. And that's what these different discourses do. And this is why I'm so interested as you guys are with kind of the marriage of CRT and MMT, as are the MMT guys, I think.
I think that's a really good distinction, right? Because I would be far less enthusiastic about expanding education infrastructure in its current form, right? It's expansion
Mm-hmm.
combined with transformation.
Mm-hmm.
I think, as you were saying, both structurally and administratively, and I think the content needs to be souped up, and not only in colleges, but in high schools too, and schools, just, like public schools. And I think there's so much you can do, especially with the Gen Z generation, right? I think there's a kind of hunger for what we're pointing to here, as much as our approaches or work may differ, right? But there is that kind of a hunger organically emerging for a more meta-theoretical angle. And so I think I just love to see that instituted, so that can be satiated and obviously have a very transformative impact on society. One thing I wanted to comment on too, Brent, was this notion of Bildung, right? Which is probably one of my favorite ideas ever, just conceptually. And there are different definitions of Bildung, right? Like with Lene Anderson has her own kind of idea of what that is, and there are different Bildung theorists. But one thing that excites me about Bildung is like, it's, to me, at least my interpretation of it, a lot of it is kind of like the best of like classical conservative thinking, right? Without necessarily all of the reactionary edges, but it's like it's conceiving of ourselves, as continually developing, evolving. There's a process of enculturation, there's education, it's character development, it's community development, it's caring about civil society and being engaged. And I just love that kind of holistic concept of self and societal growth and evolution. And this is kind of where I on our first episode of MIP, Nate and I were critiquing Hanzi's work. And I think what they're doing is a very specific, with the listening society and emphasizing developmental theory, it is a very specific vision of Bildung. But I think every culture, and I'd go to say every culture and every ideological camp has its own implicit idea of Bildung in a way, right? Even if it's like a kind of like a distorted or fucked up notion of that, it's still implicit in that, right? So like another part of the work that I do, kind of steel manning different ideological schools and then talking to them and working with them on their own terms, is to see like, well, where in their philosophy is there an implicit Bildung that they may not be conscious about, and then kind of feeding that and using that as a vehicle for self-growth. So just a quick example, I was talking to a Black woman who lives in Atlanta who's a mediator, does a lot of great work depolarizing like conversations on racial justice. And at a mediation gathering, she had said, like if someone comes to one of my meetings and says that I don't see race, I'm colorblind, I know they have more growth to do as a person. And that really stuck with me, because I was like, okay, that like part of the growth as she's conceiving of it, right, through her frame, is gaining a larger awareness of historical societal power dynamics and how that instantiates themselves in different identity groups, and getting a robust understanding of social justice and so forth, that occurs through dialogue and through mediation, right? And so it's like, okay, how can we build that, right? Because like she explicitly connected those notions to personal development and self-growth. So it's all there. It just needs to be kind of nurtured on their own terms. And my concern with Hanzi and like all of the, and you can push back if you want, like the MHC model of development is such a specific lens. My concern is that it can kind of like block our ability to see diverse cultures' own notions of Bildungs on their own terms, so that we can nurture those seeds, right? It's kind of like, I don't want people to have an overly rigid model of what development looks like and then try to like impose that on people, right? Like, what is Bildung already in your own conception? How can we feed that towards more growth and evolution and towards the metanoia, right? What do you think of that?
Yeah, I agree with the critiques against the MHC. I think you nailed it with your definition of Bildung and why that's good and whatnot. Not to sound like kind of exceptionalist or whatever, but I don't know if every country or culture does have their own version of Bildung, like implicitly, right? I think it's the fact that this is an explicit term that as a word, it's a big abstraction, which contains all these things, right? And so Thomas Bjorkman is a fierce advocate for it, because it literally like comes from his country too. It's a German word, but it's like practiced in Scandinavia. And then, Jonathan Rowson wrote a 10,000 word piece on it. So like it takes a complex introduction to really get it. And So like, and I don't have to point to like less developed countries, which of course have been under the thumb of imperialism and colonialism and stuff. But the United States itself, they don't have Bildung. They don't have anything like it, right? But like my impression is the opposite, that they dumb down their population actively. There's mild fetishization of civic engagement, right? But that gets very quickly enfolded back into patriotism. So, right, if you're a right winger with this, you're just running with that and carrying waving a flag. Might be an American flag, might be a Confederate flag. But if you're a left winger doing it, you are trying to advocate for something like Bildung, like education, like free thought, fair and open elections, election justice, racial justice, economic justice, and anti-war, right? But what I'm saying is there's no formal concept in the US. There's no formal institutions for it. There's a massive military apparatus that takes more than 50% of the discretional budget. And so what does that leave for like Peace Corps and, civil society and stuff like that? It's hollowed out. So that's not to say every culture doesn't have some radical tradition. I think it does, but Bildung is a way to formalize it, to make it universal, right? So it's not just exporting the Scandinavian model, but just in abstract terms, valuing civic education, political participation, well-rounded human being, personal development. So yeah, that's something we need to lean into, I think, and support as part of metamodernism.
Yeah. One thing I will say that's unfortunate with the U.S. is if you study U.S. history, there are seeds of Bildung, in my opinion, cropping up here and there. So one example is Benjamin Franklin's Junto clubs and gatherings that are based on civic engagement and personal development, right, and community and economic development. And then there's kind of the pragmatist lineage with John Dewey and that really valorize civic engagement as part of a healthy democracy. But it all gets, that tradition is not prominent, right? It all gets lost.
When you were offline for a bit there, I mentioned the transcendentalists and the Quakers. That was more in the spiritual part of the conversation, but they were very politically active too, right? And so that for me is part of this American Bildung and socialist tradition that you're speaking to.
Right. So it's like where are the seeds that could be watered or resuscitated that's already kind of latent in the American psyche or collective imagination, and then finding that to really tease that out so we can build on something that's in the background and just needs to be uncovered. So anyway.
Yeah.
I think it went past the seed and seedling state. I mean, we're listing all these things, but we put them all together. It starts to look like a tradition of Bildung, especially with the Quakers, from my home state of Pennsylvania, by the way, the Keystone State, that did hold it all together. I think it was quite well flourishing for a lot of our history, and only recently I think it's gotten suppressed. So I think it's right there below the surface, and it has to do with institutional structures more so than the psyche of Americans.
The EU has its own civil service, right? You can I applied for it once. I didn't get in, but you can be a civil servant for the EU itself, right? And that's sort of it's holistic, cosmopolitan on that continental scale. And, so where's the civil service for the U.S.? Where do I sign up? It's all about military recruiting. Oh, you can get free college and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, but it's like this, this is state violence. And it's obsolescent. It's decadent. It's wasteful. It's antithetical to peace building, right? So let's take that same amount of resources and transition to a peace industrial complex, right? So instead of people going off to military college, people can go to whatever college if they join the army, but it's about transitioning away from that status quo of we need to be violent and be tough and be strategic and be geostrategic to kind of just bring that concept home. Like it's such a waste of resources. Like the whole bloated intelligence apparatus, like Edward Snowden showed that not only was all this illegal data collection happening, but that it was like pretty useless, pretty ineffectual, pretty wasteful, to do so. And so many people are employed to those ends, and so few of them realize it and defect, as Edward Snowden did, right? So yeah, part of trying to promote the idea of Bildung is then trying to consolidate and crystallize American forms and institutionalize them. It should be a part of the next left political platform, right? Where the Bernie movements failed because they only gave kind of lip service to Scandinavian countries and didn't really have a meta theory. Hopefully we can do better next time. Hopefully. And I always feel like we're in a time crunch, right? The faster the liminal web gets its shit sorted out, the faster we'll stop generating problems and stop fighting and be able to converge and put forward a confident sort of consensus that allows people at various levels of being informed or develop, so to speak, to sign on, to get on board, right? What we don't want to do is keep attracting reactionaries that are like, oh, this is a right-wing thing, and Trump is meta-modern. Like, no, no.
Yeah, and just to kind of highlight what you were saying there, Brent. I think the unfortunate thing about the military in the United States is everyone knows that the military serves other functions than just national defense.
Yes.
Right? That for
yes.
people who are, you grew up in a economically impoverished area, you don't have meaning in life and everything. There are latent functions of the military so it serves those purposes.
And civil engineering is a part of that military function, and that's a good thing, but that's what I'm saying is it should be demilitarized, right?
Those are important functions that we need to instantiate in another way that doesn't lead to war and invasion and
so
PTSD and so forth.
This was Bernie's platform. I think he gave lots of voice to it, but maybe didn't unpack it enough, and right. That's that he said, my foreign policy is going to be dismantling the military-industrial complex and redirecting military resources to fight climate change. I think there's a beautiful story to unpack there, but he got across that talking point a number of times, and that's what it is, right? That's what we need to do with this military, and so it's refreshing to listen to deconstructing conservatives or deconstructing military people that have that inside perspective and also agree and know that's what we have to do and are on the learning curve of joining that conversation.
And an affirmative picture of what that looks like is really important too, right? Like I did AmeriCorps. I don't know if you've heard of AmeriCorps. It's a Peace Corps for America.
Okay.
Right. So it's exactly what Nate did in the Peace Corps, except instead of doing it in a foreign country, I did it right here in Hawaii, where I grew up.
Okay, cool.
And that was a great experience for me. Like I got skills. I felt like I was doing something important, and that was a time where I was personally suffering with a lot of insecurities and anxiety and depression, and like it was really meaningful to like take part in a larger civic project to help the community where I can learn skills and develop myself. So like. The pay is total shit, right? It's like below minimum wage. It's a stipend, so it doesn't even qualify as like minimum wage. You don't really get any like decent. You get like a $5,000 education award to pay off your student loan debt at the end of it all, right? And so like just envisioning like how these programs can be made much more robust, and we can have a kind of civic draft to do good stuff in the community. that serve similar functions in the military. You learn important life skills, you learn discipline and service and all that good stuff, right? Except it doesn't end with you having PTSD and going blowing up another country or whatever.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. And it comes back to listening. If you listen to frontline war reporting and victims talking right now, and soldiers defecting, soldiers having their own breakdowns and metanoia moments, it's happening all the time. We just don't hear about it enough.
Well, I think that was a very fast 2 hours, especially since I was AWOL for the first half an hour or so. But Brent, thank you so much for coming on. It's always fun to riff with you and talk to you about these things. Nate, did you have anything you were going to say before we?
I have a meeting in a few minutes with my deep state, apparatus that I work for here. So, I do have to go. But yeah, thanks Brent for coming on, and thanks for all you do. And do you have anything?
Well, likewise. I mean, I appreciate what you guys are doing, and like whenever I talk with any of you, it really helps me. And this conversation has been stimulating along a lot of different lines that I think need to be continued. So yeah, really appreciate it. And yeah, we did well with a clean 2 hours. So yeah, I'll see you guys later. Thanks for connecting. I hope audiences like this, whoever listens, and that they of course like subscribe to your channel and mine and engage and interact, because we want to make this accessible, even though it's pretty high level kind of stuff. We want to keep it grounded, and we want to grow in numbers. That's not out of any like personal ambition or career goals at all. It's just about making the world a better place and making our jobs easier.
What I would urge listeners to do is read. And we kept saying this, actually read the work and stop quoting people that you haven't read.
Yeah. And
read Brent Cooper stuff on his Medium page. It's really great.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll say, like, as a writer and a reader, both of those are hard. Reading, I struggle with reading. Reading's fucking hard. And that's the point, though. It's like if you want to get in really good shape, you need to exercise, right? It's hard, and you're better to do the best exercises, the most efficient forms of exercises, especially if it's fun, like a sport, right? And so it's the same with mind practices, with discipline, with kind of stretch, with warm-ups and stretching and intensity training. You gotta get your hands on the good stuff. Read C. Wright Mills, classic entry-level radical sociologist, kind of gets people on board with that kind of thinking about elites and masses, sociological imagination. Read us, engage with us. I got some good